On September 14, 2007, a clerk in the Douglas County Courthouse in Nebraska stamped a document that would send a shockwave through the entire legal world. It was a lawsuit, like thousands of others, but the name listed for the defendant wasn't a person or a corporation. It was God. The newspapers called it the act of a madman, a joke taken too far. But the man who filed it was no fool. He was one of the most powerful politicians in the state. Today, we push past the laughter and the headlines to ask a question that strikes at the very heart of law and faith. What happens when a man uses a human court to demand justice from the Almighty? To understand the lawsuit, you first have to understand the man. Ernie Chambers wasn't some crackpot off the street. He was a living legend in Nebraska politics. For nearly 4 decades, he was a senator in the state's unique one-house legislature. He was a lion, a civil rights champion whose voice boomed through the marble halls of the Capitol, fighting for the poor, the forgotten, and the marginalized. He was known for his razor-sharp mind, his unmatched eloquence, and a stubborn refusal to back down from any fight he believed was just. He was a master of the law. He didn't just know the rules. He knew their spirit, their history, and most importantly, their weaknesses. He had spent a lifetime watching the gears of justice turn, sometimes with agonizing slowness, sometimes with breathtaking fairness. He believed in the system, or at least he believed in what it was supposed to be, a shield for the innocent and a sword against the powerful. But in the mid-2000s, Senator Chambers saw a sickness creeping into the courts he so respected. He saw lawsuits that seemed to defy common sense, clogging the dockets and turning halls of justice into a circus. People suing for anything and everything, using the sacred process of the law to settle petty grievances or chase easy money. To a man like Chambers, this wasn't just inefficient. It was a perversion, a mockery of the very idea of justice. He felt the system was becoming a parody of itself. He could have given a fiery speech on the Senate floor. He could have written a scathing newspaper column. But Ernie Chambers wasn't a man who settled for small gestures. He believed that to expose an absurdity, you had to meet it with an even greater absurdity. An idea began to form in his mind, an idea so radical, so audacious, it could only come from a man who knew the law so well he was willing to break its unwritten rules. He decided he would file a lawsuit of his own. But his target wouldn't be a person or a company. He would aim higher. He would take the logic of the frivolous lawsuit and push it to its absolute metaphysical limit. He was about to demonstrate the flaw in the system by creating a case so perfectly logical and yet so utterly impossible that no one would ever be able to forget it. The calm of the Nebraska judicial system was about to be shattered. And so, on a Friday in September, Ernie Chambers walked into the Douglas County Courthouse and fired his shot. The document he filed read not like a legal complaint, but like an indictment against the cosmos itself. With the cold, precise language of the law, he laid out his case against the defendant, God. He accused the Almighty of being directly responsible for untold suffering, for unleashing deadly floods, terrifying hurricanes, and violent tornadoes upon the world. The lawsuit went further. It charged God with making terroristic threats on a global scale, promising death, destruction, and eternal damnation to billions of people, including Senator Chambers and his constituents in Nebraska. It claimed the defendant's actions sowed fear, incited hatred, and led directly to wars, oppression, and genocide. And what did the plaintiff demand? Not money. He demanded a permanent injunction. He asked a human judge to issue a legal order telling God to stop. You can just imagine the silence in the clerk's office as they read the defendant's name. But it was a legally filed document, and they had no choice but to accept it. The news spread like a prairie fire. First, it was a local curiosity, then a statewide joke. Within days, it was international news. The courthouse was flooded with calls from journalists around the world. Was it real? Was the senator serious? To anyone who thought it was a prank, Chambers had a chillingly simple and logical response. He argued that if the courthouse doors were open to any citizen with a grievance, no matter how frivolous it seemed, then they had to be open to him too. He was a citizen. He had a grievance. He had identified the responsible party. The system, he was saying, had to either hear his case or admit that its doors were not, in fact, open to all. The trap had been set. The court had no choice but to respond. The case landed on the desk of Judge Marlon Polk, a man who had dedicated his life to the clear, predictable order of the law. And with that, the entire judicial system of Douglas County, a place built on evidence and procedure, found itself staring into a black hole of its own making. The machinery of justice, designed to handle earthly disputes, had just been tasked with judging heaven. You see, for the wheels of justice to even begin to turn, a fundamental step must be taken. The defendant must be officially notified. A summons must be served. It is the cornerstone of due process, a right so sacred that without it, no case can proceed. And that single simple rule became the entire battlefield. The lawsuit's central question wasn't about floods or tornadoes. It was this: how do you hand a piece of paper to a being who is everywhere and nowhere at once? In the courtroom, Senator Chambers stood before Judge Polk, his face a mask of solemn purpose. He argued with brilliant, infuriating logic. He stated that since the defendant, God, is by definition omniscient, he must already know about the lawsuit. Therefore, a formal summons was an unnecessary piece of human bureaucracy. The court was in a bind. To agree with Chambers would be to make a theological ruling. To disagree would be to ignore the plaintiff's point. Imagine being Judge Marlon Polk, sitting on that bench, the weight of centuries of legal precedent resting on your shoulders. The courtroom wasn't filled with the sounds of chaos. There were no shouts, no struggle. There was only a profound, suffocating silence. It was the sound of a system encountering a problem it was never designed to solve. The air was thick with the tension of an impossible choice. The world's media watched, waiting for the verdict, but the judge was trapped. This wasn't a slaughter of men, but a slaughter of certainty. The weapon wasn't a rifle, but a paradox. Every path the judge could take led to a contradiction. If he dismissed the case as frivolous, he would be violating the principle of open courts that Chambers was so cleverly exploiting. If he allowed it to proceed, he would be throwing the rulebook out the window. The case became a ghost in the machine of justice. It couldn't move forward. It couldn't be dismissed on its merits. The court, an institution of immense power, was rendered utterly impotent. The legal process was bleeding out on the courtroom floor, not from a wound of violence, but from a single, unanswerable question. The mighty sword of the law had struck against the infinite, and it simply stopped. For weeks, the lawsuit hung in the air over Douglas County, a question mark suspended in the halls of justice. The initial shock had given way to a tense, expectant silence. In his chambers, Judge Marlon Polk found himself in a legal no-man's land. He couldn't simply laugh the case out of court. Ernie Chambers was a respected senator, and his legal argument, however bizarre its premise, was technically sound. He was exploiting a loophole in the system's own philosophy of open access. The judge was a man of the book. He searched through volumes of case law, looking for precedent, for any case in history that could offer a sliver of guidance. But there was none. He was searching for a map in a country that didn't exist. The choice before him was monumental. Either he would break the court's own procedural rules, or he would allow a case against God to proceed. Either option would create a legal earthquake. Outside the courthouse walls, the story had become a global phenomenon. Legal scholars debated the jurisdictional paradox on television. Theologians argued the implications of a court even considering the matter. Late-night comedians told jokes, but beneath the laughter was a genuine fascination. Ernie Chambers had done more than file a lawsuit. He had posed a philosophical riddle that caught the imagination of the entire world. And what of Senator Chambers himself? He was the calm at the center of the storm. He gave interviews, not with the triumphant smirk of a prankster, but with the measured tone of a professor. He calmly and patiently explained his reasoning to anyone who asked. He wasn't trying to win, he was trying to teach. He had laid the trap, and now he simply watched as the entire legal world wrestled with it, exposing the very absurdity he had set out to demonstrate. The community wasn't in fear, but in a state of captivated disbelief. The courthouse, normally a place of quiet, everyday dramas, had become the stage for a once-in-a-lifetime spectacle. Everyone was waiting. The silence from the judge's chambers stretched on, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was the silence of a system thinking, of a man wrestling with an impossible problem, preparing to render a judgment that would be remembered for decades to come. And then, the day came. Judge Marlon Polk entered the courtroom, the weight of his decision palpable in the silent, crowded room. This wasn't a trial in the traditional sense. There were no witnesses called to the stand, no dramatic cross-examinations. The battle was fought entirely on the sterile landscape of legal procedure. The world's media held their breath, waiting to see how a small county court would solve a problem that had stumped philosophers for millennia. Judge Polk didn't try to answer the unanswerable. He didn't rule on whether God was responsible for hurricanes or whether the lawsuit had merit. He did something far more clever. He found his answer not in theology, but in the mundane, practical rules of civil procedure. He found the one thread that could unravel the entire case without touching the explosive questions at its core. He dismissed the case. But the reason he gave was a masterpiece of judicial logic. He stated that for the court to hear a case, it must first have jurisdiction over the defendant. And to establish that jurisdiction, the defendant must be properly served a summons. Since the defendant, God, had no fixed address and could not be served notice, the court simply had no power to proceed. The case was thrown out not because it was absurd, but because in the eyes of the law, the Almighty couldn't be found. It was a brilliant legal escape. The judge didn't try to slay the dragon. He simply declared that there was no address to send the challenge to. But Ernie Chambers didn't see it as a defeat. He stood before the reporters, a slight, knowing smile on his face. He argued that the judge's ruling was, in its own way, a profound victory for his cause. For the court to declare that it couldn't find God's address, he reasoned, it first had to implicitly acknowledge that there was someone to find. The verdict was in. The law of men had been applied. The system had protected itself by retreating behind its own procedural walls. But was it justice? Or was it the most elegant sidestep in legal history, a moment where the human system of rules looked into the infinite and chose, wisely, to look away? The gavel had fallen, but the real questions were left hanging, unanswered, in the quiet air of the courtroom. The television cameras eventually left Omaha. The reporters filed their last stories, and the world's attention moved on to the next spectacle. But the case of Chambers versus God never truly disappeared. It simply sank into the bedrock of legal history, becoming something of a legend. Today, it's a story told in law school classrooms, a famous case study used to teach the dry-as-dust concept of jurisdiction. It's a ghost story that lawyers tell, a cautionary tale about the absolute limits of the law. As for Senator Ernie Chambers, he didn't fade into obscurity. He went right back to the Capitol building and continued his life's work. He remained that lion of the Nebraska legislature for years, a fierce, unapologetic voice for his constituents, a constant thorn in the side of the establishment. When he finally left office, he was the longest-serving state senator in Nebraska's history. His legacy is one of fighting for the powerless, and this lawsuit was just his most famous weapon in a long and storied career. And the lawsuit itself? That document is still there, filed away in the archives of the Douglas County Courthouse. It's just a few pages of typed words in a manila folder, a humble physical artifact of a metaphysical battle. It bears no special markings. It isn't framed on a wall. But it is a silent witness, a tangible piece of a story that seems too absurd to be true. It's proof that once, a man walked into a courthouse and tried to hold the creator of the universe accountable under the laws of Nebraska. Most people have forgotten the headlines, and the name Marlon Polk is just another name on a long list of judges. But the system remembers. The archives remember. The story of that impossible lawsuit has become a permanent, if strange, part of American legal folklore, an echo in the halls of justice that serves as a quiet reminder of the day a mortal man used human rules to challenge the divine. So we come back to the question we started with. What happens when a man uses a human court to demand justice from the Almighty? The simple answer is, the court finds a way out. The system protects itself. But that's not the real lesson here. Ernie Chambers never expected to win an injunction against God. He wasn't trying to stop the rain. He was trying to make a point. This story isn't really about a battle between a man and his maker. It's a story about a brilliant mind using the logic of the law against itself to ask an eternal question. Who is truly responsible for the suffering in the world? And where are the limits of our own systems of justice? He held a mirror up to the court and forced it to admit that there are some problems, some defendants, that are simply too big for its rules to handle. It's a story of protest in its purest, most creative form. It teaches us that sometimes, to expose an absurdity, you must become an even greater one. Ernie Chambers was willing to look like a fool to the entire world to prove a point about the sanctity of justice. He never got a response from the defendant, but he forced a worldwide conversation, and in doing so, he achieved a far greater victory.